much for joining us today. Thank you for coming over from Teens to collaborate last minute. You were all so amazing. And today, to introduce our speaker, we have the Dean of Human and Social Sciences, Dr. Stephanie Scroggins. So thank you, Dr. Scroggins, for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Northrup. And good afternoon, everyone. And before I introduce our esteemed speaker, I would like to remind all of the students to write your questions in the question and answer section, and also to fill out the attendance evaluation form at the end, okay? So I would like to introduce our speaker. Dr. David J. Silverman is Professor of History at George Washington University. He is the author of several books in Native American, Colonial American, and American racial history, including This Land is Their Land, the Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and Troubled History of Thanksgiving, and Thundersticks, Firearms and the Violent Transformation of Native America. He is a recipient of the William Hickling Prescott Award for Excellence in Historical Writing, given by the Massachusetts branch of the National Society of the Colonial Names of America. His essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, National Geographic, and the Daily Beast. We would like to welcome Dr. David J. Silverman. Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon.
I'm delighted to be here with all of you. I realize there are a lot of demands on our attention this week. I'm actually coming to you from Philadelphia, which is at the epicenter of our political drama at the moment. And so I would be delighted to join you under any circumstances. I'm especially delighted to have a distraction from national news for at least a brief while today. So thank you so much for having me. Before I turn to the heart of this talk, I'd like to offer some contextual remarks. It might be jarring to some members of this audience to see the word Indians in my book title and to hear me use it during this appearance today. After all of us should know that the word Indians is a misnomer propagated by Europeans. After all, we're not in India. Now, in recent decades, some people have substituted the term Native Americans for Indians in an effort to be more accurate and racially sensitive. Yet, in the course of my many years of interactions with Indigenous people all across the United States, I've learned that most of them, albeit not all of them, favor the term Indian when referring to them collectively in the aggregate, though almost to a person, they prefer tribal names when appropriate. The point I'm making here is that it's out of deference, not indifference, that I use the word Indian. I also want to emphasize that though my book and the talk here today focuses on historical Wampanoag people and strives to include their voices at every opportunity, let's be clear, I'm not Wampanoag, if my surname didn't give it away, and this isn't a history that's told from a modern Wampanoag perspective. To be sure, my conversations with modern Wampanoag people have informed the content. Indeed, those conversations were the inspiration for this book. But there is some material in this talk and in my book that some Wampanoag people today find dubious, outright wrong, and even none of my business as an outsider. Now, I've tried to take those criticisms into consideration in advance by having conversations while I was working on this book with Wampanoag people, and by soliciting responses to a draft of the book from historically minded Wampanoag people. I also followed a team of Wampanoag staff at the Plymouth Plantation Living History Museum during the week of Thanksgiving a few years back. I've offered to Wampanoag people to include dissenting opinions alongside my own, all the while acknowledging that the playing field is uneven because ultimately I'm the author. So ultimately, the responsibility for all editorial decisions in the book and in this talk belong to me alone. And I want to be clear, in the final analysis, I've made choices based primarily on the standards of my discipline of history. And sometimes those standards rub modern Wampanoag people the wrong way. I want to urge all of my listeners here today and anyone who reads the book to seek out the Wampanoag's own opinions about this history. And they're widely available. Simple YouTube searches will turn up plenty of examples of print and film, online interviews, and the like. My hope is that in this book and in talks like this one, Wampanoag and other indigenous people will see an informed, well-intentioned attempt to take the Indian call to take Indian history seriously, in the context of a greater American history. So, with those qualifications. Now, for generations, Americans have been telling themselves a patriotic story of the supposed first Thanksgiving, that treats colonization as a consensual, bloodless affair. In this tale, and I assume that most of you are familiar with it, the Pilgrims, religious dissenters from England, cram aboard the Mayflower to brave the stormy Atlantic in search of freedom of conscience in America, or religious freedom as it's often stylized. These sea-tossed adventurers land off Cape Cod in Massachusetts with a copy of their proto-constitution, the Mayflower Compact, and after some fruitless exploring and brief contacts with the natives, decide to found their settlement up the coast at a place they call Plymouth. Yet, the story goes, the future of this colony is very much in doubt during its first couple of months because the Indians, rarely identified by tribe, on whom the English know they must depend for food and protection, seem to be at best wary and at worst hostile. However, eventually the natives reach out to these newcomers through the interpreters Samoset and Squanto. The Thanksgiving myth sidesteps the obvious question of how these figures managed to learn English, nor does it explain why the natives suddenly were so friendly. The natives' chief, Usamiquin, it means yellow feather, whom the English know by his title, Massasoit, even agrees to a treaty of alliance with Plymouth. Over the spring and summer, the Indians feed the Pilgrims and teach them how to plant corn and where to fish, whereupon the colony begins to thrive. That fall, the two parties seal their friendship with the famous First Thanksgiving. The peace that follows permits colonial New England, and by extension, modern America, to become blessed seats of freedom, democracy, Christianity, and plenty. As for what happens to the Indians next, this story has nothing to say. The Indians' legacy, according to the Thanksgiving myth, is to present America as a gift to white people. Or in other words, to concede to colonialism. Like Pocahontas and Sacagawea, the other famous Indians of early American history, they helped the colonizers and then move off stage. The Wampanoags of what is now southeastern Massachusetts, who are the Indians in this drama, have long contended that this tale is not history, but a myth that sugarcoats the viciousness of colonialism for indigenous people. My book and this talk here today reckons with this uncomfortable assertion and its implications. For instance, in traditional accounts of Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims step onto Plymouth Rock and into a new world or wilderness, when in fact human civilization in the Americas was every bit as rich and ancient as in Europe or anywhere else in the world. History did not begin for the Wampanoags with the Mayflower. They already had a dynamic past countless generations old that shaped who they were and what they did, including in their encounters with the English. In other words, they inhabited an old world. And as this illustration here suggests, the so-called wilderness in which the English arrived was full of villages, roads, cornfields, historic monuments, cemeteries, and forests cleared of underbrush, all by Indian design. What you're seeing here, this is an illustration by the French explorer Samuel de Champlain, who cruised southern New England in 1605, 15 years before the arrival of the Mayflower, and he's depicting here cornfields and natives all around what would become known as Plymouth Harbor. Wampanoag's recent history mattered too. Though the Thanksgiving myth suggests that the Pilgrim Wampanoag encounter was a first contact episode, in fact, it was just one in a string of bloody meetings between the Wampanoags and Europeans since 1524, and particularly from 1602 onward. Another drawing by Samuel de Champlain captures this violence. The Thanksgiving myth portrays the Wampanoags as timid and overawed by the Pilgrims. But I show in my book that the Wampanoags were easily the stronger party during Plymouth's early years. And here you see a map of Wampanoag country during this period, a place full of Wampanoag communities. The English did not dictate to the Wampanoags. Instead, the Wampanoags initially used Plymouth colony as a pawn in their tribal and intertribal politics. It will come as a surprise to most of my readers that the celebrated first Thanksgiving feast actually played a minor role in this relationship. I hate to disappoint everyone, but the first Thanksgiving really was not a big deal to the participants. Far more influential in shaping the alliance were a series of other, less palatable episodes, filled with violence and power politics. I also submit that our emphasis on the nearly 50 years of peace following the first Thanksgiving and its associated treaty of 1621 elides the more important point, that the Wampanoags came to resent the colonists' aggressive and underhanded dealing. The truth is that the English and the Wampanoags nearly came to blows repeatedly during the supposed long peace, particularly after the death of Usamequin or Massasoit in 1660, culminating in the terrible King Philip's War of 1675-76. Most histories that bother to include the Wampanoags end with this war. It's supposed to be the end of Wampanoag existence. But my book contends that accounting with the Thanksgiving myth as a white lie requires tracing Wampanoag's struggles with colonialism through the centuries right up to the present day. This perspective is especially urgent, I think, as our America, as modern America, grapples with new manifestations of white nationalism, while at the very same time, Indigenous Americans in New England and all across the country are reasserting their sovereignty and their political, economic, and cultural self-direction. We need long-term historical perspectives to understand these dynamics. So to explore these themes and bring Wampanoag voices to the foreground, I'm going to focus this talk on 3 cases spread across the centuries in which Wampanoags or other Native people closely affiliated with them posed counter-narratives, alternative views to white people's triumphalist histories. I want to begin with our first revisionist historian, who is none other than the Wampanoag sachem or chief Pametacom, better known to history as King Philip, after whom King Philip's War is named. In the late spring of 1675, some 50 years after his father Usamequin or Massasoit had greeted the Pilgrims, Pametacom sat down to talk with a delegation of English magistrates from the colony of Rhode Island. So this is Wampanoag territory, and this is where he met with those delegates from Rhode Island. Now, the English Rhode Islanders were there to encourage Peckham to agree to a peaceful arbitration of the Wampanoag's mounting tensions with Plymouth colony. It seemed to everyone that a war was possible. Yet Pemedicom had already resolved to fight and agreed to this conference only to explain why. It produced one of the great documents of early American history in which you can really hear a native leader's voice. Let's consider what Pemedicom said that day. Pemedicom viewed the history of Wampanoag-English relations as little more than the colonists' failure to live up to the promise of the 1621 alliance. The sachem recalled that when the Pilgrims first settled at Plymouth 55 years earlier, Usamequin, and I quote here, was as a great man, and the English as a little child. Pemedicom, and you can see his father's mark on a land deed here, Pemedicom contended that Usamequin could have wiped out the infant Plymouth colony if he had wished. Instead, he held back its native enemies, and there were many, fed the starving colonists, and granted them ample tracts of land. Now, Pemedicom had a selective memory here. He conveniently left out that his father had made this choice less out of altruism than a need for allies, because the Wampanoags had been hobbled by a plague between the years 1616 and 1619, whereupon their rivals, the Narragansett tribe to their west, began trying to subjugate them to the status of tributaries. Pemedicom also overlooked his father's desire to become the point man in trade with the English in order to consolidate his authority over the loose Wampanoag polity. But generally speaking, Pemedicom was correct that Plymouth would have become yet another English lost colony if it hadn't been for Wampanoag largesse. And how did Plymouth show its gratitude decades later, now that it had become the great man? Well, Pemedicom, and you can see his mark here using his English name, Philip, Pemedicom cited the example that in 1662, Plymouth had seized, and he alleged, fatally poisoned his brother, Wamsutta, or Alexander, because the English feared that he was plotting an intertribal anti-colonial league. More recently, the English had used the testimony of a Christian Indian to arrest, try, and execute 3 of Pemedicom's leading men for the supposed murder of another Christian Indian, John Sassaman, who had been leaking Wampanoag intelligence to colonial authorities. To Pemedicom, Plymouth's executions of the accused Sassaman murderers and its presumed assassination of his brother Wamsutta, they were bad enough as discrete events. But worse still, these offenses crystallized a vast array of English wrongs against the Wampanoag people, and him in particular. Pemedicom denounced that in English courts, and I quote here, focus on the language here, it's a little staggered. Remember, this is 17th century prose, and it's a 17th century prose of a native speech being translated from Wampanoag to English. But Pemedicom denounced that in English courts, and I quote, if 20 honest Indians testified that an Englishman had done them wrong, it was as nothing. But if one of the worst Indians testified against any Indian suspected by the English, that was sufficient. Furthermore, the English had begun to interfere in criminal matters between Wampanoags within Wampanoag country. Pemedicom railed, and I quote again, that whatever was only between Indians and not in English townships, they would not have us prosecute. About half of the Wampanoag tribe, mostly on Cape Cod and the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, had adopted Christianity and sworn off Pemedicom's leadership, as well as the responsibility to pay him tribute. They did so, fearing no reprisal from the sachem, because Christianity entitled them to English protection. What you're seeing here, by the way, is a title page from the first Bible printed in North America ever. It's in the Wampanoag language. And here you're seeing writings in the margins of such Bibles by Wampanoag people who had acquired literacy in their own language, which was not traditionally a written language, in mission schools during the 17th century. So Plymouth is sore that some Wampanoag people have been using Christianity to form a closer alliance with the English and throw off their tributary obligations to him. And there were still other issues. The English used land deeds, some fair, some foul, to claim Wampanoag territory for their own exclusive use under their own exclusive jurisdiction. Well, this practice ran contrary to the native people's expectation that their land sales merely conveyed permission for the English to settle among them. Or in other words, for the English to become part of Wampanoag society. In other words, they viewed the English as buying into Wampanoag society rather than these land sales having the English buy the land from out of the Wampanoags. When Indians resisted, colonists flooded the contested tracts with livestock and slapped any Indians who injured the animals with trumped-up criminal fines and lawsuits. The point was to force holdout natives to release their claims and resign themselves to the English interpretations of these sales. Machinations like these, schemes like these, gave the colonists, as Plymouth put it, 100 times more land than now the king, meaning Plymouth himself, had for his people. In short then, to the Wampanoags, English law was nothing more than a shakedown by people with short memories and thin loyalty. Given these patterns, Plymouth asked rhetorically, why would he put any faith in a negotiated settlement proposed by Rhode Island? History taught that the English would just use some technical violation as an excuse to confiscate his land and even kill him. The Rhode Islanders, seeing where this conversation was headed, cautioned Plymouth that it would be suicidal for the Wampanoags to resort to arms, because, they said, the English were too strong for them. In that case, the sachem retorted, and I quote here, then the English should do to them, the Wampanoags, as they did when they were too strong for the English. In other words, he called on the colonists to assume the role of the great man by acting with generosity, restraint, and justice toward the Wampanoag little child. And that's where the conversation ended, because everyone knew this wish was futile. Just days later, Plymouth led a Wampanoag force against nearby English towns, prompting a war that would engulf the entire region and ultimately break the back of Indian power in southern New England. This war is the most basic feature of the Wampanoag-English relationship that the Thanksgiving myth studiously ignores. Initially, Wampanoag resistance fighters got the best of it by repeatedly sacking exposed English settlements and ambushing colonial troops on the march. Furthermore, soon they had the support of an array of other native people, Nipmucks, Narragansetts, Pecumtucks, and Secokis, whom the colonists turned into enemies by violating their neutrality, such as attempting to confiscate their arms and demanding them to turn over Wampanoag non-combatants. The English made things worse for themselves by treating the thousands of Christian Indians who pledged fealty to the colonies as wolves in sheep's clothing. Massachusetts and Plymouth colonies herded the Christian Indians into island concentration camps, where the people suffered malnutrition and exposure. The warring Indians took advantage of these colonial missteps to accumulate victories in which they claimed the lives of upwards of 3,000 Englishmen, destroyed 16 colonial towns, and slaughtered 800 head of cattle. However, the resistance eventually collapsed, partially because other Indians threw in their lot with the English. I want to call our attention here to this region right here, on the Hudson River, and what's in modern day New York. So in February of 1676, the Mohawks of the Iroquois League, or the Haudenosaunees, as a gesture of alliance to the young English colony of New York, drove Pimedicom's winter camp away from Dutch and French gun markets on the Hudson River and eastward back into the teeth of colonial New England forces. So this is the pattern right here. And lying in wait alongside the English were the Mohegans and Pequots of Connecticut. So you see the Mohegans here and the Pequots are here. And Christian Wampanoags from Cape Cod right here, who under duress had sided with the colonists from the beginning and who were just as adept at forest warfare as the resistance fighters. Meanwhile, the warring Indians and their families were stalked by hunger and disease as they lived in cramped quarters on the run, far away from their cornfields and fishing stations. Consequently, by the late spring of 1676, growing numbers of them began to accept a late English offer of quarter or mercy in exchange for switching sides. Others managed to avoid this terrible fate by escaping to the upper Hudson River Valley or Canada, where they built new lives. But most of them never made it that far. By June of 1676, Indian prisoners were telling their English captors that Pimedicom, and I quote, was ready to die, for you have now killed or taken all his relations and almost broke his heart. Those relations included his wife, Watunakanooski, and his son, we don't know his name, who colonists captured and sold into the horrors of Caribbean slavery. They were but two of an estimated 2,000 Indians, men, women, and children alike, who the colonists sentenced to slavery, and not only in New England, but as far away as the West Indies, Gibraltar, and Tangier. Some of these poor souls had surrendered based on English promises of mercy, only to discover that the terms were harsher than colonial officials had pledged. Worse still, some surrendering Indians learned too late that colonial authorities would not spare any native person who they suspected of having taken an English life. Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Rhode Island held public executions throughout the summer and fall of 1676, including 50 hangings on Boston Common alone, an event which Boston has yet to commemorate. The English even exacted retribution on the dead. On August 6, colonial forces discovered the drowned body of Weetamoo, a female sachem, war leader, and the sister of Pimedicom's wife. And this is where they found her. Authorities ordered her head to be severed and piked next to a holding pen full of Wampanoag prisoners. The captives, according to English accounts, and I quote, made a most horrid and diabolical lamentation, crying out, "It was their queen's head." A few days after this incident, Pimedicom was dead too, shot down by a Christian Indian who the English called Alderman. Filled with a vengeful spirit, Captain Benjamin Church had the sachem dismembered and his head sent to Plymouth. There, on the very site where the sachem's father had allied and feasted with the Pilgrims, authorities mounted their grisly trophy and left it there to rot for the next 20 years. It might have been one of the last things that Pimedicom's wife Watunakanooski saw when Plymouth shipped her from her homeland into slavery. Later that week, Plymouth held a day of thanksgiving in praise of God for saving the colony from its enemies. I think we can all agree. These horrors are as contrary to the traditional Thanksgiving story as it gets. Though history rarely pays attention to the Wampanoags after King Philip's War, my book emphasizes that this conflict was the first stage in a centuries-long battle to defend their land and sovereignty. It should come as no surprise to any of you that the English seized nearly all of the Wampanoags' land in the decades after the war, leaving only a handful of town-sized reservations for mostly Christian Indians. Please note, I didn't frame this process as the Wampanoags losing their land, as if they were responsible, as if they lost it by mistake. That's a euphemism. Colonists and their successors took it. The English also seized the Wampanoags as bound laborers. From the late 1600s through the mid-1800s, white merchant creditors, courts, and government-appointed guardians colluded to force the Wampanoags and their children into indentured servitude to white farmers, householders, and whaling merchants. The terms routinely lasted several years and even decades. One of my colleagues in the field calls this judicial slavery, and I think she's right. Such debt peonage and court-ordered servitude made it nearly impossible for the Wampanoags to sustain their normal social patterns, including the process of raising their children, to the point that very few Wampanoags could speak their natal language, their ancestral language, by the mid-19th century. Enter William Apis, the Pequot-born preacher to the Mashpee Wampanoags on Cape Cod, who is our second native figure after Pametacom to dispute white American self-serving, sanitized histories. In 1836, Apis wrote his Eulogy on King Philip, which used a revisionist account of the Pilgrim Saga to call attention to the plight of indigenous people. In it, Apis argued that Indians were the real heroes of Plymouth's founding because they comported themselves like real Christians, whereas the supposedly saintly pilgrims behaved like villains and hypocrites. Apis meticulously laid out how the pilgrims had introduced themselves to the Wampanoags by desecrating their graves and looting their corn, then had the audacity to turn to Usamiquan for help. Yet the chief, to his moral credit, obliged, like a true Christian, imbued with the principles of charity and forgiveness. No people could be used better than they were, Apis intoned. The Wampanoag the English venison and sold them many hogsheads of corn. Had it not been for this humane act of the Indians, every white man would have been swept from the New England colonies. Apis also contended that Massasoit's son Pametacom was, and I quote, the greatest man who ever lived upon American shores. Apis ranked him even higher than George Washington, because the sachem fought against a darker tyranny and for greater freedom with far fewer means at his disposal. In Apis's telling, Pametacom was no misguided hothead for taking up arms against colonial dominance. Rather, he was a sage, because he foresaw, and I quote from Apis, that the white people would not only cut down their groves, but would enslave them. And how true the prophecy. Our groves and hunting grounds are gone. Our dead are dug up. Our council fires are put out. It was all an outgrowth, Apis said, of a fire, a canker, created by the pilgrims from across the Atlantic to burn and destroy my poor unfortunate brethren. In light of this sordid history, Apis proposed that Indians should treat every December 22nd, the anniversary of the Pilgrims' landing in Plymouth, and every 4th of July as, and I quote, days of mourning and not joy. Let them rather fast and pray to the Great Spirit, the Indians' God, who deals out mercy to his red children and not destruction. This call by Apis to commemorate that Native people bore the burden of white America's triumphs would continue to resonate with Wampanoags long after he was gone. Less than 40 years later, in the 1860s and early 1870s, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts addressed the stubborn refusal of the Wampanoags to disappear by dissolving their reservations of Mashpee, Herring Pond, Gayhead, Chappaquiddick, Christiantown, and others. The state divided the common lands of these places into private property tracts, subjected those lands to taxation and confiscation for debt, and declared the inhabitants to be full-fledged citizens and no longer Indians, as if the two were antithetical. White officials congratulated themselves that in their magnanimity, they had bestowed legal equality on Indians, just as New England pressuring white Southerners to do with black freedmen and women under Reconstruction. They refused to listen to the Wampanoags, who protested that they didn't want citizenship, that this supposed gift was actually a Trojan horse to rob them of their remaining land and force them to scatter. And that was indeed the point. White proponents of this measure, at their more honest moments, admitted that they considered the Wampanoags to be too racially intermixed to be classified as Indians any longer, and that, in any case, it was the fate of Indians to vanish. So better get on with it. Over the next century, white Americans did everything they could to make that supposedly natural process occur, including reducing Indians to romantic bit parts in the country's history, as exemplified in the Thanksgiving myth. I want to emphasize here, throughout the colonial era, Thanksgiving had no association whatsoever with Pilgrims and Indians. The link between the holiday and the history appears to date to 1841, when the Reverend Alexander Young published a primary source account of a 1621 harvest feast hosted by Plymouth Colony and attended by neighboring Wampanoags. And here, by the way, is his account. To this account, Young added an influential footnote. And let me tell you, as a historian, there aren't a lot of influential footnotes in history. And this footnote read, "This was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England." Over the next 50 years, various authors, artists, and lecturers from New England disseminated Young's idea until Americans generally took it for granted. So this is not a tradition, but an invented tradition. Predictably, New Englanders were the first to tout the Pilgrims as national founders, and their dinner with Indians as the template for Thanksgiving. But for the rest of the country to go along, the nation first had to subjugate the tribes of the Great Plains and the Far West. Only then could white people stop vilifying Indians as bloodthirsty savages and give them an unthreatening role in a national founding myth. The Pilgrim Saga also took hold because it had use in the nation's culture wars. It was no coincidence that the Pilgrims emerged as founding fathers amid widespread Protestant anxiety that the United States was being overrun by Catholic and then Jewish immigrants, supposedly unappreciative of the country's Protestant democratic origins and values. Additionally, treating the Pilgrims as the epitome of colonial America served to minimize the country's record of racial oppression past and present. Better to highlight the Pilgrims' religious and democratic principles, instead of the Indian wars and slavery more typical of colonies. Through such means, Northeasterners could define the so-called Black and Indian problems as Southern and Western exceptions to an otherwise inspiring national heritage. So what I'm saying here, then, is that though Americans eventually assumed that the Thanksgiving holiday had been associated with Pilgrims and Indians since 1621, that tradition was a product of white Protestants in the 19th century, particularly Yankees, asserting their cultural authority over European immigrants, Americans of color, and other regions of the United States. This invention became tradition by the early 20th century, and it has remained so in no small part through American schools holding annual Thanksgiving pageants. This is particularly prominent in the Northeast and the Midwest. In these Thanksgiving pageants, students dress up as Pilgrims and Indians to reenact the first Thanksgiving. I will admit, I myself remember participating in such a performance, and in it, we were kindergartners, we sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee," praising America as a sweet land of liberty and the Pilgrims as my fathers. My fathers. The point of this exercise was to have a diverse group of school children learn about who we as Americans are, or at least who we're supposed to be. Even students from ethnic backgrounds would be instilled with the principles of representative government, liberty, and Christianity, while learning to identify with the English as fellow white people. Leaving Indians outside of the category of my fathers also carried important lessons. It was yet another reminder about which race ran the country and whose values mattered. Lest we dismiss the impact of these messages, let's take a moment to consider the experience of a young Wampanoag woman who told me that when she was in grade school, the lone Indian in her class, her teacher cast her in one of these pageants as Chief Massasoit and had her sing, "This land is your land. This land is my land." At the time, she was just embarrassed, but now as an adult, she sees the cruel irony in it. Other Wampanoag people have told me about their parents objecting to these pageants and associated history lessons that the New England Indians, like other Eastern Indians, were all gone, only to have school officials question their claims to be Indian. Authentic Indians were supposed to be primitive relics, not modern. So what were they doing in school? Speaking English, wearing contemporary clothing, and returning home to adults who had jobs and drove cars. By 1970, Frank James, the third in our sequence of Native revisionist historians, had reached the limits of his patience with such nonsense. James was born and raised in the community of Aquina, or Gayhead, on Martha's Vineyard, which had long ranked as one of the poorest communities in Massachusetts. Nevertheless, James grew up determined to succeed and represent his people. As a teenager, he even adopted the Wampanoag name Wamsutta, after the eldest son of Usamiquin, who preceded Pemecom in calling on the Wampanoags to resist colonialism. James's inner drive carried him all the way to the New England Conservatory of Music, where he studied trumpet, and then to the Nauset Public Schools on Cape Cod, where he became director of music. Yet his passion was political activism and the study of Wampanoag history, because he understood that knowing the past was critical to reforming the present. What he read in the primary sources made his blood boil, because it bore little relation to the Thanksgiving myth that weighed around his people's neck like a millstone. So when James was invited to speak at a state banquet celebrating the 350th anniversary of Plymouth's founding, he saw it as a rare opportunity to set the record straight. Yet when he submitted a draft of his speech for review, white officials rejected it as too inflammatory. James, for his part, found an alternative script to be so childish and untrue that he pulled out of the event altogether. Instead, he drew up plans for a commemoration where there would be no censors. Inspired by the Red Power movement for indigenous rights and justice, James organized a National Day of Mourning to be held on Thanksgiving Day 1970 at the site of the Massasoit statue overlooking Plymouth Rock. In choosing this name, James hearkened not only to National Days of Mourning held after the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, he also reached back to William Apis's eulogy on King Philip. And like Apis incarnate, when James's moment came, he rose up before protesters from all across Indian country, media, and onlookers, and delivered that inflammatory speech that Massachusetts tried to suppress. He began with the poignant assertion that he had the right to the dignity of his humanity despite society's efforts to finish him and his people. I speak to you as a man, he stressed, a Wampanoag man. I'm a proud man, proud of my ancestry, my accomplishments, won by strict parental direction. Despite his family and community suffering what he called poverty and discrimination, two social and economic diseases. He acknowledged to his white listeners that Thanksgiving, and I quote, is a time of celebration for you, celebrating the beginnings of the white man in America. For James and the Wampanoags, however, they had doleful implications. It is with a heavy heart, he explained, that I look back on what happened to my people. Like Apis, he proceeded to tell a history of English Wampanoag relations that turned the bedtime story of the Thanksgiving myth into a nightmare. His conclusion was that Miquin's welcome to the Pilgrims, quote, was perhaps our biggest mistake. We, the Wampanoags, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it would be the beginning of the end. That before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people. To James, like Pometicon and Apis, the moral of the first Thanksgiving is that the English and their white successors have betrayed the Wampanoags who befriended them in their time of need. And this is the message that is echoed through subsequent national days of mourning, which the United American Indians of New England have continued to hold each Thanksgiving right up to the present day. The question for all of us was and is how to move forward. The answer, according to James, is to confront this history, including the fact, as he put it, that the Wampanoags still walk the lands of Massachusetts. James also urged his fellow Americans to consider Indians as worthy of the same respect as everyone else. Let us remember, he counseled, the Indian is and was as human as the white man. The Indian feels pain, gets hurt, and becomes defensive, has dreams, bears tragedy and failure, suffers from loneliness, needs to cry as well as laugh. If the American people followed this counsel to extend their Indian countrymen and women basic compassion and acknowledgement, it would make Thanksgiving Day 1970 a new beginning toward what James called a more humane America, a more Indian America, in which Native people, and quote again, could regain the position in this country that is rightfully ours. There are so many reasons for Americans to follow James's lead and attempt to tell the history of Plymouth and Thanksgiving with three-dimensional Wampanoags at the center. Thanksgiving eclipses Columbus Day as the focal point for considering the Native American role in the nation's past. It's bad enough to have gotten the story so wrong for so long. It's downright inexcusable to continue the annual tradition of having teachers, politicians, and television producers traffic in the Thanksgiving myth, and residential homes and centers sport decorations of pilgrims and Indians. These practices dismiss Native people's real historical traumas at white hands in favor of depicting their ancestors as consenting to colonialism. To call the consequences harmless is to ignore the chorus of Native Americans, our fellow Americans, who say the hurt sound, particularly to their children. This population has already suffered far more than its fair share in the creation of the United States. I should note that Native people have also contributed disproportionately to the military in every single one of the nation's wars. In a pluralistic country, it's morally unacceptable to allow the celebration of a national holiday to damage part of the nation's people, remind those people, or for that matter, all of the people. Whereas the identity politics of marginalized groups tends to focus on achieving justice and equality, or in the Indian case, also sovereignty, white identity politics has always centered on oppressing others. Yet there's been too little public reflection on how the Thanksgiving myth teach white proprietorship of the nation. Why should a school-aged child with the name of, say, Silverman identify more with the Pilgrims than the Indians? After all, such a student is unlikely to descend from either group, and the descendants of both groups are Silverman's fellow Americans. If the student is taught to think of both Pilgrims and Indians more dispassionately as they instead of we, it might be a step towards a more critical understanding of history, in which we can see all of the actors as fully human, with all of the virtues and shortcomings that one would expect to see in any population. On the other hand, if the student is taught to think of both groups more inclusively as we, aware of the associated risks of appropriation, it might be a step towards a more compassionate national culture. Boy, could we use it. This vision would have school curriculums treat Native American history as basic to an understanding of American history in general. Such lessons would address the civilizations indigenous people created over thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans, the ways in which they have suffered and resisted colonization, and how they have managed to survive and adapt to modern life while maintaining their distinct identities and defending their indigenous rights. Units on American government would address the sovereignty of Indian tribes as a basic feature of American federalism. Such a shift might also feature bringing Indians and their concerns into the national conversation, including having presidential candidates hold a serious discussion about their Indian policies and the state of Indian country, something I have never seen. If the public continues to associate Pilgrim-Indian relations with Thanksgiving, the least we can do is try to get the story straight, with Wampanoag actors and perspectives at the center. Imagine if instead of trafficking in the mythical Thanksgiving, we as a country reckoned with the story as told by William Apis and Frank James. Now, the challenges are significant at many levels. Many Americans are uncomfortable with the Native American past. It tends to turn patriotic episodes inside out and turn heroes into villains, or at least into deeply flawed heroes. It loosens white claims on morality and authority. It raises political and cultural questions about justice. It threatens to tear down monuments and rename buildings. But confronting this darkness also promises to shed light, cultivate national humility, and more importantly, signal to Native people that the country values them as us. As one gracious Wampanoag elder once told me, we do ourselves no good by hiding from the truth. And I think she was talking about all of us. Amen.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Delighted to share it with you.
There's several different questions in the chat now. Our first comes from Dr. Peter Martinez, who says, in your interactions with Christian Wampanoag Indians, do they express gratitude for Christian expansion to Americas despite their loss of life, land, and power that resulted from colonialism?
It's a great question. Though the Wampanoags were generally Christian by the end of the 17th century, in more recent times, many Wampanoags have disowned Christianity. They've thrown off Christianity in favor of what they would consider to be nativist or traditionalist practices. They see, those Wampanoags who follow that path, see Christianity as a Trojan horse for colonialism and want nothing more to do with it. Now, that said, there is still a remaining population, a minority of the Wampanoag population, that is Baptist, Jehovah's Witness, Pentecostal, and the like. And most of them contend, when we have conversations about these things, that colonists didn't bring Christianity to them. They contend that their ancestors already knew about Christianity before Europeans arrived. Suffice it to say, the relationship between Christianity and colonization is fraught for them and most other Native people.
Thank you so much. The next two questions kind of go together. And one says, I agree that we teach a myth to children. We should learn the truth as we study more. How do we suggest we tell that story in a more accurate light?
Well, I don't think you should unleash on grade school children a story of epidemics, genocidal warfare, colonial subjugation. It's not age appropriate. I do think, though, we do our kids and ourselves as a country a terrible disservice if we use a shared meal as a symbol for Indian colonial relations. I think you ask any reasonable person, even if they don't know the details of the story, whether that's an apt symbol for Native colonial relations, and they'll say, well, no, of course not. So I think what we do is we begin in the schools by insisting that any lesson on American history begins with the basic premise that all of us, wherever we are on an indigenous land, and that we need to know the histories of the indigenous people who are ancestral, who are indigenous to that land. And we should treat that story not just the week of Thanksgiving or in Native American History Month, but Native people, like African American people, need to be part of any chapter of American history we're teaching, from first contact right up to the present day. The tendency to treat Native people in history only when they represented a threat to Europeans does a real disservice to our understanding of how important Native people were throughout Native American history. And more importantly, it makes modern Native people invisible to us. It doesn't allow us to understand how they have changed and adapted under incredible oppression across the centuries. Now, I'm asking a lot here. Most history instructors are not prepared to teach from that perspective, but I think it's absolutely essential.
Thank you so much. Should we talk to children's schools about perpetuating these false narratives? And how do we maybe protest Thanksgiving? Is it appropriate for white people to also hold a day of mourning on Thanksgiving instead?
Well, let me be clear. I love Thanksgiving. And many Native people that I know like Thanksgiving. I don't think anyone, even those who are well versed in this history, are opposed to the idea of getting together with family and friends and offering thanks for what's good in our lives. That's not what I'm taking issue with. What I'm taking issue with is attaching a false history to that holiday. Now, let's be clear. People celebrated Thanksgiving for the better part of 200 years without attaching the Thanksgiving myth to it. The two don't need to go together. So the point I'm making is if we're going to associate the story of Pilgrims and Wampanoags with Thanksgiving, we need to get it right. Now, how do you get it right in the schools? Well, I think at basic, parents need to tell teachers that they will not accept their children participating in these pageants. It's racial brainwashing, and it is not right. The goal of a history education is not to turn people into little patriots. The goal of a history education is to teach students to understand a complex history in all of its complexity. And so that ritual is doing nothing to further that end.
So what is the best way to approach people who might have colonialist tendencies about the truth about Thanksgiving?
Well, I think you begin with that basic question and you say, look, do you think a shared meal in which friendly Indians grant their country to Europeans is an appropriate symbol of Native colonial relations? Again, most thoughtful people will say no. And then you ask, so why do you want to perpetrate a lie? Why should that be the symbol? That's the one story that most people know about Indian colonial relations during this period. Do you want to perpetrate a lie? Now, some people are perfectly happy living in a web of lies. I'm fully aware of that. But I think most thoughtful people will say no. And, it's a slow process of conversation and education that I hope will bring people around. But this is not an easy fight to have. Again, most Americans are deeply uncomfortable with confronting the Native American past. I think we've made much more progress in integrating African American history into our mainstream curriculum than we have Native American history. It's going to take a lot of work, thought, and self-reflection to get to the point where we as a country are honest enough and confident enough to confront this past.
This next question, it kind of goes along with that. So it's no surprise that the colonization of the New World has negatively impacted natives. Why has it taken America so long to realize that Columbus Day is not something that should be glorified, resulting in many renaming this holiday into Indigenous Peoples Day?
Because Native people have not mattered until very recently, and indeed I would contend that for most of the population they still don't. For most of the history of American history education, the purpose of the history education is not to be critical about the past, but to cultivate patriotism, to cultivate love of country. And the main narrative was about how the United States emerged as a beacon of democracy, liberty, opportunity, and Christianity for the rest of the world. And that's not a perspective that permits much room for many critical views. It's only since the 1960s that there's been an insistence that a more critical perspective on American history should be front and center. Now, it's been easier to integrate African American history and women's history because those groups have more of a population and political power than Native Americans. Native Americans are a minuscule part of the overall American population, and they don't have much political leverage. And therefore, they're not in a position to insist on Native American history being taken seriously. You know, as for Columbus Day, I think part of the issue is that, you know, Columbus is widely associated by white people with the supposed greatness of Western civilization. What's more, many Italian Americans view Columbus Day as, in effect, Italian Heritage Day, and are offended at the idea that their cultural hero would be knocked off the pedestal. So there's a lot of political issues at play in all of this.
And this last question that we have here, we have some really just very positive comments and a lot of gratitude in here too for your talk today. But our last question is, do you think the recent McGirt versus Oklahoma ruling represents a positive shift that could be part of the sort of changes you mentioned near the end of your presentation?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a really positive shift, and let me explain why. So most modern Americans who are not Native have no understanding about the legal status of indigenous people in the United States. They don't know if they're full citizens. They don't understand whether they pay taxes. They don't understand why some Native people have rights that other people don't. And part of what I was contending in this talk is that we need to explain in our grade school and secondary schools the distinct status of Native Americans as the first people. Native people are not just another minority group. Most minority groups in the United States want equality and justice, right? They want to be full members who can participate in American society on an equal basis and be treated with justice and dignity, just like white people. That is not what Native people want. They certainly want those things now. I would note that before the late 1800s, equality within American society would have been colonization to them. But they have been colonized, they have been conquered, and now they want equality and justice. But they want something more than that. Native nations are entitled to sovereignty, to self-government on their own land. And that makes them different than any other group within the United States. What's more, they have a constitutional right to that sovereignty. Treaties that are ratified by the United States Senate are, under the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. The supreme law of the land. That means that treaties that Native nations signed with the United States during the course of the 1800s entitle them to these rights. Now, I recognize, of course, that the United States has disregarded the status of those treaties as the supreme law of the land over time. But what that recent Supreme Court ruling said is, well, the fact that the United States hasn't followed the law doesn't mean that it's not still the law. And so the United States needs to reckon with this history and start to teach people that Indian reservations and the sovereignty of Native governments on those reservations is as much a part of American federalism as the distinction between the federal government's power and the state government's power.
Wow, that's incredibly powerful. I hope you take a chance to just read in the chat all the really wonderful comments and everything that everyone is saying in here. And on behalf of the history department here on the Northeast campus of Tarrant County College, we are so grateful that you joined us today and that we were able to hear your talk. And it is going to be recorded and posted for our students as well, for those who weren't able to attend live. And thank you so much. I think we'd give you a round of applause if we were all, I think we're all probably clapping on our computer right now. One last thing for the students who are here, please see the Google form that is in the chat so that you can fill out your attendance and evaluation for today. And Dr. Martinez just posted it again, thank you. And remember, we're giving away 5 copies of This Land is Their Land, but by the book that this talk was based off of today. So make sure to fill it out so you can have it mailed to your location in this special time. I'm so, everyone is always talking about all of the things we're missing out on, and yet really sometimes there's these great opportunities as well to be able to have a speaker like Dr. Silverman join us here at TCC. We're really grateful for that. So everyone, I hope you have a great day. I hope that we are able to look in a more nuanced way now at Native American Heritage Month and at Thanksgiving ourselves. And I'm sure at our Thanksgiving tables we'll all have some interesting facts to tell our family and friends now. So yes, thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.